Here's what you're missing over at patreon.com/Addressing Gettysburg.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this episode of Addressing Gettysburg. And today we are talking with a gentleman named Dave Malgee. And Dave is he's a very well-known man around town. No one has a bad word to say about Dave. He's a very nice guy, very friendly guy. He was born in Rochester, New York in 1954. He graduated from the State University of New York at Oswego, received an MA in history from the University of Richmond in 1983, started a business in Richmond in 1979 with his brother, and he served as the chief operating officer there for 36 years. He retired to Gettysburg in 2015, which I know a lot of you want to do. Began serving on the board of directors of the Gettysburg Foundation, served as interim president and CEO of the foundation from 2020 to 2021. He still serves on the board, and he's got a tremendous collection of Civil War artifacts at his home. I had the privilege of going there twice and seeing it, and both times it was as if it was the first time. One was actually the first time, and then the other one was the second time, but there's just so much stuff in there, and it's so beautifully laid out and everything like that. It's a shame that it's not open to the public because it really is nice. But he's brought some of his stuff here with him today, and I'd like to welcome Dave Malgee to the show. Welcome, Dave.
Well, thank you, man. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is a pleasure to have you. We've been talking about doing this for over a year, so I'm glad we finally got around to doing it.
Sure.
All right, so you get into collecting. Is this something that you've done since you were a kid, or like to start with baseball cards or something? Or
Well, I did collect baseball cards.
Okay.
Like everybody does.
Uh-huh.
I think I ended up with 7 Mickey Mantles, but they were all in a scrapbook, so they weren't very valuable when the time came to cash in my chips. I actually have always wanted to have a museum.
Okay.
And about when I was 11 years old, I actually had a Civil War museum in my little playroom, and I tried to scam the neighborhood by saying they were legitimate Civil War artifacts. And I remember an older kid came by and he saw a canteen on the wall, hanging on the wall, that I said was a CSA canteen. He flipped it over and it said BSA for Boy Scouts of America. So I was, it wasn't a great moment for me, but
right. But you tried.
I did. And
did you charge for this museum?
No, thankfully. I'd probably been taken to small claims court.
Right.
But I actually began collecting in the 80s when I did some relic hunting down in Petersburg, Virginia. And then I kind of got sidetracked, and I had a collection of New York Yankees artifacts. Mm-hmm. And that was pretty substantial, and through that I got to meet a lot of Major League Baseball players. As I had told you earlier, before we were online here, that Johnny Oates, who managed the Orioles and the Texas Rangers, was a dear friend of mine, and I collected a lot of his stuff. And then
he went to be a member of Hall & Oates.
Yes, not quite. He actually went up to heaven, is what he did.
That Johnny Oates.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. So, but good point. But anyway, we had some issues in our business, and I sold that collection because I thought I was going to need that money in the business. And as it turned out, we didn't. Biggest mistake I ever made, but it did lead me into Civil War, actually Gettysburg collecting. I'm exclusively focused on Gettysburg artifacts, and I only decided to do that when we came here to Gettysburg in 2015.
Makes sense. Yeah. So what was do you remember the first Gettysburg item you bought?
I do. It was a set of 3 large maps, the Warren maps, which were dated 1876.
Okay.
And they're still in my library hanging on the wall.
And that's when you first walk in the house.
Yes, sir.
Those that you showed me at the end there, yeah.
And that's the one group of artifacts that my wife loves. She doesn't want me to ever get rid of those.
Good. So. And you're also kind of a Custer nut like me and Jim Hessler.
I hate to lump myself in with Hessler, but yes, we've been actually going back and forth because I just got a letter from Charles Varnum in which
wow.
he kind of makes fun of Custer in the letter, and Jim's got to come on over and see it. There's a few things he hasn't seen yet, but that's true. My grandfather, Elmer, who was born in 1887, actually met Libby Custer at one of the resorts in the Catskills when he was very young, and that made a real impression. Of course, Libby lived till 1933,
right?
So it made a real impression on him, and I think that's truly where I got my love of history, through my grandfather.
Through your grandfather,
yeah, who knew Civil War veterans.
Sure, yeah. And that again, every time something like that comes up, we always try to pause and illustrate that that's how close the Civil War was to us. Is that there are people alive who either know someone who met a Civil War veteran or had met a Civil War veteran themselves, like Dean Schultz. He told me stories about sitting in front of that big tree in front of his house as a little kid listening to veterans talking. So I mean that's so close to where we are.
And of course, when we lose Dean, look what we do lose. In addition to Dean the man, it's all that knowledge and the experience, and he's been so important to Gettysburg, I think, over the last how many years.
I agree. And every time I see him, I keep saying, I want to interview you because, when you're gone, it's all gone. Like there's a lot that needs to be kept for posterity, and I think I'm getting around to him. I think eventually he'll do it.
Oh, he'd be a great interview. I know that.
I think so. I mean, one time when I first moved back here in 2018, my friend Dustin and I were exploring around, and I had done a ranger walk with Troy Harmon, and Troy pointed out Webb Avenue, that you can still see it in the grass. And I don't know how many times I'd been over that ground. I never noticed it, but it just gave me a thrill, And then I became obsessed with old park roads. And we went to the visitor center. We asked a ranger, I just found out about Webb Avenue. Are there any other roads like that? And he goes, well, have you gone to Lost Avenue? And we said, no, what's that? And he's like, well, you could go there and there's a path you could take, but you might get shot. And he goes, it's best to take this guy's number. And he handed me Dean Schultz's number, and we called him and left him a voicemail. And we figured we'd never hear back from him. In 20 minutes, he calls us back. He says, yeah, you can come to my house. I'll show you where it is. So we figured, we'll go, we'll pull up. He'll be like, yep, just up the hill there. You can't miss it, He took us up there and then gave us a 2-hour tour of the area.
Oh, yeah.
And we felt like we were like special, Then I found out it takes people there all the time. But for that moment, we felt great. And it was just, I'd never heard these stories. I didn't even know about it beforehand. He is just a treasure, really.
Yeah, and I've been out there a couple times myself, and Dean has shown me around, and it really is a great experience.
It is. So, so the 3 maps were your first Gettysburg item. And then what did that lead to? Like, did it just snowball from there, or was it gradual over time? Because when did you started this in 2015?
2015. So
that's not long ago.
Pretty much snowballed.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, because you got a lot of stuff.
It started out by me collecting representative pieces of Civil War weaponry.
Okay.
And I did that through the Horse Soldier right here in Gettysburg, the Small Brothers. Mm-hmm. I kind of we just hit it off, and we became friends. And they were actually in Richmond a year or so later, and they were at a show, and they stopped by my home, and they had a lot of Gettysburg artifacts that had been found on the battlefield, and we made a trade. And I traded all that representative stuff, rifles and swords and things like that, and I acquired my first Gettysburg artifacts. And the very first one that I got that actually came off the battlefield was a rooster pin from the 7th Ohio up on Culp's Hill. Mm-hmm. And those things are extremely rare. If you know that story, they all had these roosters, and their colonel was actually killed flapping his arms, crowing like a rooster, along with his lieutenant colonel later in the war. So it's a pretty crazy story.
It's like when they go out on the boat ride and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Remember that?
You know what? I never saw that
really?
movie. But I do
these crazy people out in public,
But I do remember I didn't want to buy it because I thought, a rooster? Are you kidding? I didn't want to trade for it. And they said, no, you got to have this. You trust us.
Yeah.
So, and I've been dealing with the Horse Soldier ever since.
So good. So that's good. So anybody that wants to get into this, maybe that's a good place to start.
Well, it is, but there are certainly other good relic shops in town, and
Sure.
and it just happens to be that I have gravitated towards them, and my daughter actually works there now.
Okay.
And it's just a great place for me to go. And I'll be honest with you, I trust those guys. And in this business, you absolutely have to trust the people you're dealing with.
No, well, so then how do you know? I remember we had a listener who years ago sent me the message on Instagram, and he's a big Lincoln fan. He loves Lincoln, and I think it was a chair from like the White House dining room or something that Lincoln supposedly sat in or something like that. But there were a lot of things, like he sent it to me and he said, can you ask the people you know, like what they think about this? And so I asked some of the people who are not as big of collectors as you are, but enough. And it just didn't sit right with them. But he was so excited.
No pun intended.
Yeah, exactly. And he was so excited to have this just based on the story. He loves Lincoln so much. And he ended up not getting it. But how do you protect against frauds and things like that?
Well, the way I do it is I try to buy artifacts that have the provenance that traces back to the early museums in Gettysburg, or that come from families, or from established old collections.
Okay.
And when I say old collections, I'm talking, 1880s, 90s, turn of the century.
Right.
The story that you mentioned, the stories, have to make sense.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, I was reading just yesterday. I'm working on a project. I'm writing a book on Eliakim Sherrill. I think I told you that. And I was looking at a letter where someone said that when the Civil War began, he asked Sherrill to help him raise a regiment, the 75th New York. And that was a really cool thing for me to have. But then when I went and did the research, I checked the records on the 75th New York, and they didn't go into service until like November of 1861, which is way after the point that this guy had said. So there's a flaw in the story, and I think you always have to be aware of that. If it doesn't make sense, it really probably is too good of a story to really believe. Although sometimes things surface that are just unbelievably wonderful, and you just look at them and you know that they're original. And obviously, part of it has to do with experience in collecting. I will admit that I went through that stage where I absolutely wanted to believe everything that somebody told me.
Yeah.
And I remember going to a Richmond show, and a lady said, this was in my attic, and it was said to come from Gettysburg. And I said, who said it came from Gettysburg? And there was no answer, so I walked away.
Are you familiar, this isn't Civil War, but several years ago, a picture purporting to be Billy the Kid and some of his gang playing croquet or cricket or something.
I do remember that.
Remember that?
Yeah.
And you look at the picture and it's taken from a distance, and everybody's the size of an ant in the frame, so you got to really zoom in. And my question is, who's the first person that looked at this picture and go, well, let me zoom in on their faces and see anything or what? And then this guy kind of looks like
probably
Billy
Frassinito.
Well, yeah, no, and that's a good point. There are people who will do that, yeah. And but still, that had to go through the ringer to be proven that, and now they believe that it actually is a picture of Billy the Kid. So sometimes things, come out of the blue, and you got to do your due diligence, or someone has to, right?
And here's a good example. There's lots of carvings on the stocks of Confederate rifles.
Right.
Okay. Now here's a bona fide artifact that lots of times people will ruin by carving a name in it. And you can, if you look at a loop, you can see where the patina of the carving does not match the patina of the gun itself. That's one example of how you check.
Okay.
For provenance.
So in other words, it's too clean. Maybe it might be too clean, and that would indicate that someone might have carved it in a year ago.
Yeah, if they carved it in the 1860s, the patina will be the same as the rest of the gun.
Right. And patina is the dirt and muck,
well,
and
the sheen, the color, all that. Just how the gun looks.
The flavor, of the way it looks. All right. So then you how many individual items do you have? Have you kept account?
I know how much I've spent. I do not know how many individual items I have, and I am not going to reveal what I've
okay,
spent.
that was my next question. I mean, but it is expensive, though. I mean, it's not a cheap hobby to get into.
Yeah, Civil War artifacts, if they're of some significance, are fairly expensive in their own right. If you are a Gettysburg collector, you're going to pay 2 or 3 times what an item is worth, or even more. Everybody loves Gettysburg, and I would say behind Gettysburg is Antietam.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously, it's going to be more expensive when you're dealing with specific battles because there's few items that can be traced to it. So, but overall, Civil War overall, if you weren't concerned about just one battle or one particular event, are things typically cheaper if it's just like Civil War musket with no real story?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Listen to the rest of this interview and dozens like it. Support the show and get early access to special episodes, early and discounted ticket sales, and more. The second lieutenant level and above gets access to all monthly Patreon episodes. So please go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg, choose a tier, and join. And I thank you in advance.